good morning, everybody. Great pleasure to be here. And Eric, congratulations on the launch of this initiative, which I think is very valuable and important in the world today. I think the way that you summed it up, that we need to create more synaptic connections between ideas in different parts of the world, is hugely valuable. The title on this session is actually called Banking in Balance, and I want to say a few words about, well, is banking in balance today, before moving at the end to some comments on the monetary policy issues which Raghu raised. Let me start with making a perhaps bold assertion, and one where you could say that I'm biased because I was involved closely in the process of re-regulation of the financial system after 2008. I think the global financial system, the global banking system in particular, is much, much more resilient now than it was 2008. And I think the probability that any time soon we will have a financial crisis developing within the financial system itself, endogenous to the inner guts of the financial system, I think that is far, far less than in 2008. I think that reflects one essential fact, that we have a much better capitalized banking system. Our most fundamental error before 2008 was that we allowed banks in their lending activities, and even more in their trading activities, to run with quite astronomical levels of leverage. And the most fundamental thing that I and others in the central bank, regulatory, treasury community did through the mechanism of the FSB and the Basel Committee between 2008 and 2012 was that we dramatically increased capital requirements. Sometimes people don't notice quite how dramatic it was, because we were operating on three levers. We changed the definition of what counted as the numerator of capital to narrow it down to equity. We changed the definition of risk-weighted assets by tightening up on many of the mechanisms for defining the weights, and we changed the required ratios. And if you put that together, we probably increased the capital ratios in the banking system by 4 or 5 times, not a small percent. Now, like many of my colleagues in that exercise, if I had been a benevolent dictator of a greenfield economy, I would have gone for still higher capital requirements, and I would have gone simply for higher capital requirements and avoided some of the extra complexities that we introduced, like more intense supervision and bail-inable debt. I'm in the camp that believes if you want to have a resilient banking system, just have a lot of equity in it. But we did make a lot of progress, and I think we are far less likely to have crises in the future than in the past. I also do not believe that that was at the expense of growth. Now, obviously, as we introduced those higher capital requirements, we had to worry about a transitional effect, because on a transitional effect to higher capital requirements, you can have a period in which banks constrain lending in order to build up equity. And there may have been some of that. That was unavoidable. But I think on the whole, most of the reasons, the vast majority of the reasons for slow bank lending growth post-2008 related to a lack of demand from credit from households and corporates who felt themselves already over-leveraged, rather than from a lack of supply from the banking system. And what is interesting is, even when the ECB was doing things like introducing its LTRO to make it easier for banks to provide more credit, if you actually looked at the analysis, for instance, in the ECB monthly bulletin, they would admit that their analysis suggested that the primary causes of low credit growth were on the demand side, not the supply side. And I am very convinced by the analysis of Atif Mian and Amir Sufi in House of Debt that in the US in particular, if you want to understand the recession of 2009 and 8, focus not on a banking system which is unable to provide new credit, but focus on over-leveraged households who are determined to deleverage. And that, I think, is even true, and indeed even more true, in the long term. I do not think that a banking system with, say, 15% equity ratios means a lower growth rate than a banking system with, say, 2% equity ratios. And I think there are here some really important issues which are unexplored in economic theory. In our economic theory, what we tend to do when we describe banks is we say two things about them. We imply that they take pre-existing money and they lend it on, and we predominantly describe that they lend money to fund alternative capital investments. I happen to believe that as empirical descriptions of what modern banking systems do, both of those statements are largely fictional. Banks create credit money and purchasing power that does not previously exist, and crucially, a crucial empirical effect, beautifully illustrated by Oscar Jorda, Maurice Schullerich, and Alan Taylor, is that most modern banks in advanced economies primarily lend money against assets that already exist, in particular real estate. That should not surprise us, because real estate, and in particular the locationally specific land on which real estate sits, is and is bound to be the predominant form of wealth in modern advanced economies. Therefore, it is what banks primarily lend money against. But it is an empirical fact with huge underexplored implications. It is an empirical effect which unleashes those waves of self-reinforcing credit creation and asset prices which end in the crisis of 2008 and which then leave us with the debt overhang after 2008. So I think we have a more stable banking and financial system because of higher bank capital requirements. I am not convinced that those higher bank capital ratios have a negative impact on future capital investment and growth, because I think to assume that banks primarily fund capital investment and thus growth is an empirical misdescription of what modern banking systems primarily do. So, is all fine in the world then, if I'm convinced that we're unlikely to have another September 2008? Well, no, it is not. Because while I am much less worried than I was or should have been back in 2008 about the stability of the financial system itself, I am very worried about unresolved debt problems in the real economy of households, corporates, and governments. I'm worried about their level of indebtedness rather than things internal to the stability of the financial system itself. And I'm worried about that because what's happened since 2008 is that the huge debt that we created prior to 2008 hasn't gone away, it's simply moved around the global economy. From 1950 to 2007, private debt to GDP in the advanced economies altogether grew from 50 to 170%. There's a pretty big increase in the leverage of the private sector, and it grew pretty much every year from 1950 to 2007. Since then, the debt hasn't gone away, it has simply moved around the global economy in two directions. It's moved a little bit from the private sector to the public sector, and a little bit from the private sector of the advanced economies to the emerging markets, and in particular to China. But if you look at total debt, private and public together as a percentage of global GDP, it is now higher than ever. And that process that the debt moves around, that isn't just sort of circumstantial, the one drives the other. The attempted deleveraging of the US private sector, well described by Mian and Sufi, and of other private sectors in advanced economies in 2009, drove economies into a recession, to which the natural and automatic response was a rise of public deficits and public debt. The money moved to the public side. And the attempted deleveraging of the US economy in 2009, of the private sector of the US economy, produced a fall of demand for Chinese exports, which convinced the Chinese authorities that in order to keep employment and growth going, they had to unleash an enormous credit boom in China focused on infrastructure investment. That was a direct response to deleveraging. So once we have too much debt, the debt doesn't go away, it simply moves around the global economy. So my concern is not with the resilience of the financial system, but with a huge unresolved debt overhang, which may at some stage produce a major downshift of demand, and we will then face the problem that what monetary policy levers will we then have available. And that is why I have believed for several years, and continue to believe now, that global interest rates are going to stay lower for longer than most people, even in today's markets, still believe. A final comment, and this is a comment suggested by Raghu's comment about monetary policy spillovers and coordination. Could there have been a better policy reaction to this debt overhang and to the deficiencies of demand that it endangered? And do we actually understand well the transmission mechanisms by which monetary policy works to the extent that it does work? Well, I think we have had, both in our practical policy and in our theory, too much reliance on pure monetary policy transmission levers which are highly imperfect. I think once we already have very low interest rates, further reductions of interest rates have a relatively small effect because the elasticity of response of either consumption or investment is small. I think if you use a quantitative frame and say, well, by QE I'm creating money, you have the problem that Raghu mentioned, that there appears in those liquidity traps to be an infinite demand for money. And if you say that the transmission mechanism is exchange rates, well, then you have the problems of spillovers, and clearly you also have the problem that at the level of the world economy, it must be a zero-sum game. An individual country can deal with a debt overhang by monetary policy-induced exchange rate depreciation, but if the whole world has too much debt and deficient demand, we cannot deal with that by devaluing all our currencies together against those of Mars, Mercury, and Jupiter. So the question is, are we simply expecting too much of monetary policy, and what is the alternative? Well, I think the alternative is suggested by asking, why is the world economy now looking better than it was 6 months ago? Why, starting in November with the OECD and then with the IMF at its WEO update in January and even more with its WEO update in April, have there been some upgrades to global growth, both a little bit in the advanced economies and also in some emerging economies? Well, it is simple, and it is clearly set out in both the WEO, the World Economic Outlook, and the Fiscal Monitor. It is because there has been actual or expected relaxation of fiscal policy in the US, in China, in the UK, and even in the Eurozone. But that raises the question, in theory, of how fiscal policy can work, how it can be stimulative if public debt is high, and if, according to the theory of Ricardian equivalence, people will anticipate that today's deficits have to be paid back by austerity in future. How does it manage to stimulate in those circumstances? And how does it work if new debt issues mean interest rate rises which have some sort of crowding out effects? Well, I think the answer was very clearly set out by Christopher Sims in his paper delivered to the Jackson Hole seminar last August. And it is that in a deflationary trap, monetary policy plays a role because and to the extent that it facilitates fiscal expansion in two ways. First, by keeping interest rates low, even in the face of massive new public debt issues. And second, by generating the quite rational expectation that if accumulated debts cannot in the future be repaid without a depressive effect, in such circumstances, the QE operations would turn out to be permanent and would thus be post facto monetization. I believe that in a deep debt deflationary trap, monetary policy works because it facilitates fiscal expansion and because all QE operations carry within themselves the non-zero probability that they may turn out post facto to be forms of permanent monetary finance. Now that raises some very important issues about how, once one has accepted that reality, that theory of how we get out of a deep deflationary trap, how do we nevertheless place appropriate disciplines on fiscal and monetary policy? Because in itself, my assertion would seem to suggest that no such disciplines exist. And I think those are going to continue to be important theoretical issues to explore over the next few years. Thank you.